Well, on Baseball Expats, we're so pleased to be joined by our next guest. It's MLB Pipeline senior writer, Jonathan Mayo. And Jonathan, we were just kind of chatting briefly before, and I think Andrew and I, in our roles in Australian baseball and with WBSC covering the international game, we probably read more of your writing than we even know sometimes about some top prospects and guys coming through the ranks. So thank you very much for joining us. But maybe you could help us describe to our listeners how you help come up with these prospects and what your job really kind of entails, if that makes sense, if you can even do that.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad this worked out. And so draft prospects or minor league prospects, because that is a slightly different process.
Let's start with minor league prospects,
Sure.
and then we'll go with the draft ones, because I think that's what we're going to be talking about a little later on.
Yeah. So on the minor league side, there's mostly three of us. It's myself, Jim Callis, and Sam Dykstra. And we split up all 30 teams. And so we're responsible for not only the overall top 100, but a top 30 prospect list for each team. And we kind of go about our team lists in different ways. And we have some people who write some of them, we oversee them, but we don't have to get too deep into the weeds on that. For the top 100, the three of us will put together, a top 100 list on our own. We'll combine them, shuffle it around a little bit based on talking it through, and then we send it out for a lot of feedback. Because we don't pretend to know everything, nor do we get to see everybody. So we actually would rather rely on people in the scouting industry, largely for those. We talk to a lot of player development people for the top 30 lists because they know their own teams the best. But then based on that feedback, we'll make alterations, and voila, that's our top 100 list that comes out every January.
So you get to watch a lot of baseball, and you get to talk to a lot of people who watch a lot of baseball and who know a lot about baseball.
No, that's it exactly. And it's one of my favorite things. I mean, that all the lists that we do, and because that's 900 prospects, and then we end up with 250 draft prospects. It can get a little tedious at times, but my favorite part of the whole thing is talking to people in the scouting industry, whether it's area scouts, for the draft lists, all the way up to scouting directors. I love talking to the farm director. I love talking about players with people sort of in baseball operations on the player development side and the scouting side is probably my favorite thing to do. And undoubtedly take too much time because I end up on the phone with someone and then we just talk for a while, beyond the nuts and bolts of what we need, but it's a labor of love.
I mean, that's the cool thing about baseball, right? You and I and Rolsey can sit here and look at numbers and players, but at the end of the day, they're human beings who are moving away from home, who are starting a new job, meeting new people. And that element is the most intriguing and beautiful part of this game. And that's what makes these conversations even better. I
do not disagree with that. And I think that sometimes that gets lost. We at MLB Pipeline, like I said, it's not like we go out and see all these players. There's just no way. And you can get caught in what they look like on quote unquote paper kids, if you're listening. So that as a flat, often white subject that people used to write notes on. But you could see it on the screen. You can even watch video, but until you go and actually scout the players, that's why I think that any team that ignores either kind of evaluation tool is really missing out. I don't think you can just quote unquote old school scout and ignore the data at this point. But I think you can go too far in the data model direction and kind of ignore can this guy play? Does he have a feel for the game? Can he make adjustments? All those things that the data can help with, but you can't really answer that question unless you're seeing them. And that's why we talk to the people who are paid to see and evaluate these players on a regular basis.
Well, that's the minor league side of things. And I kind of want to jump to the college side of things, which is really the purpose of this call, Jonathan. I'm calling my dad later today, and like clockwork, he's going to ask me about baseball. I've been watching a little bit, following some Aussies, but I want to sound smart, even though I literally know nothing about college baseball and the players that are there. But we're getting to the pointy end of the season, so I don't know. How does it work for you? Can you give me a couple little nuggets I can try to entice my dad into why he should jump into this college baseball world at this particular point in the season?
It's not a great year for this conversation, but sure, I'm game. I think the thing that's probably the most interesting are the arms. I think, and I'm very, very focused on this year's draft class. So there could be a freshman or even a sophomore who's doing really well. And unless it's like Jamie Arnold a year ago as a sophomore, just, dominating in postseason play, it's not going to stick in my brain. So there are a number of college pitchers, and I think teams are always hoping that the college arms will separate themselves because you never can have enough pitching. They're a little more advanced. It's not quite as risky as the high school arms. And there are a number who have kind of separated themselves, maybe not run away and hit at the very, very top. Jamie Arnold has kind of always been there, and he's been a little up or down, the Florida State lefty. But there are a couple of other lefties who, I don't know if they've passed him. Some may say they have, but they've caught up with them. I'm working on a mock draft of the first round that's coming out at the end of this week while we're recording. And Kate Anderson from LSU and Liam Doyle from Tennessee are both performing exceedingly well and doing it kind of differently. Anytime you have a college arm from the SEC doing well, you're going to take notice. And Doyle probably has slightly more electric stuff, but not everyone loves his delivery. There's a little effort there, and so people are concerned. And Kate Anderson's stuff isn't as exciting, but they like the delivery. But he walked off the mound last week with an apparent injury. Now he's pitching this week. Supposedly it was just a cramp, but you always worry. So I think there are going to be a lot of people watching Kate Anderson pitch this weekend to see what happens there. Kyson Witherspoon at Oklahoma is the best right-handed college pitcher in the draft, and he's got a chance to go in the top half of the first round. And then the one other college pitcher to keep an eye on is Tyler Bremner from Santa Barbara, who got off to a so-so start, but has been red hot lately. And I think he's going to float back up towards the top 10. So you may have 5 or 6 college arms go in the that top half of the first round, which hasn't happened in quite some time. So I think that's the crux of the cream of the crop in college baseball. It's not that there aren't hitters. Ava Arquette at Oregon State has had a really, really good year. Jace Lavalette swings and misses a lot, but the power is legitimate. He's super athletic. So I think I've covered all the. Here are the college guys who could go in the top half. There are a couple other here and there, but those are the storylines that really jump out to me.
Are the college guys, and I mean, probably the top 2, I mean, I guess at least with Jim Callis's first mock draft, putting sort of Liam Doyle and Kate Anderson in that 2 and 3 spot, going to the Angels and Mariners, respectively. Is that mostly because the thinking is that those 2 teams want a guy that can be available in the next 18 months as opposed to potentially a project guy? Because everything I'm reading, everybody thinks that Seth Hernandez is probably the most talented pitcher in the draft class.
Correct.
Obviously, he's a prep talent, and we all know what happens when you draft a prep arm. It's not the lottery, but it's probably as close as you can get to the lottery. So is the thinking that potentially those 2 top college guys go before Seth Anderson solely because potentially the Angels and the Mariners are looking for help quickly?
I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that the Mariners would take Seth Hernandez. I also don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that the Nationals take Seth Hernandez at 1. And that's never happened. A high school right-hander has never gone number 1 in the history of the draft. I'm kind of rooting for that to happen because it'd be such a great storyline. I think there is about as much chance of the Angels taking Seth Hernandez as there is me growing hair on the top of my head. And I know this is a podcast, but no, it's just not going to happen. So the point you're making with the Angels in particular, forget 18 months, 18 minutes. They they move guys very, very quickly, and it's been hitters with their first pick. There isn't really that college hitter. You could take Ava Arquette there, and that would fit the mold. But I think you don't draft based on need. But I think because the Angels do aggressively move guys and get them in the big leagues quickly, the fact that they drafted Zach Nato a couple of years ago and they drafted Christian Moore last year, I would be surprised if Ava Arquette was at the top of their list. Now, there's a lot that needs to go in. They'll do interviews, they'll do medicals, signability will come into play. So we don't know the answers to some of those questions, but I think why you're seeing the Angels in particular with a college arm there is because of that, because that's the guy that, even if they don't put him in the big leagues the day after he signs, because after a long college year, it's a guy that could be in the big leagues as early as the following season. And I think, Jamie Arnold is probably the closest to the big leagues. But those other guys have shown that their stuff wise and their ability to compete at a high level. I would have had more certainty about Jamie Arnold, even potentially being in the conversation at number one, but his stuff has fluctuated a little bit this year. He's got a really long track record of success, more so than the other guys, and I think that does work to his advantage. But that would be the only reason why he doesn't go, in the top three. But I will tell you that in my next mock, he will be in the top three.
Spoiler alert.
Yes.
I'm going to make a statement that is stupid to say, but I'm going to say it anyways, and that baseball is not football. My career. Oh, I like you, Jonathan. No, baseball is not football, right? At this time of the year in football, people, and when you're coming to the draft, are evaluating how they're doing in bowl games and in big games and in big moments. Now, we're about to enter a fun part of the college season, like the SEC tournament starts next week? In the middle of it, and that's basically that is a gauntlet of a tournament and one heck of a hard one to win. How much do you think scouts or teams really evaluate players based on their performance in those SEC tournaments, or is the 52 games that some of these players have already played kind of enough data in the baseball world that they've said, we've seen what we need to see, kind of thing?
I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle of those 2 points, in that it's not going to be the be all end all, unless someone gets hurt or something along those lines. But obviously you want to see what they do under that kind of spotlight. And and how they react to it. Now, when you're playing in the SEC, there are plenty of opportunities to see how they do against really, really good competition. That's why the SEC has kind of run away and hit as by far the most competitive college conference. You're going to see the most first rounders from there. University of Tennessee may have 14 guys drafted this year. It's the separation, especially because of the transfer portal. You have more and more top talent funneling into that conference. But I think that, you definitely can see how someone does under those circumstances. And there are definitely times where guys can take off, especially if they're injury questions. And that this draft there's a lot of uncertainty. Every baseball draft has uncertainty, but there are a lot of, I'm not sure, every single one of those college pitchers have some kind of question mark, whether it's Liam Doyle's delivery. Kyson Witherspoon is super athletic, but he only pitches out of a stretch. There's some reliever risk there. So seeing any of these guys in postseason play, it gives you extra looks. That doesn't mean you throw away the year's worth of the previous summer, whether they're on the Cape or played for Team USA. You don't throw that out the window. It's all put together, in a collective binder, so to speak. But I think that, especially when there are questions to be answered, seeing how they react. Liam Doyle has certainly helped himself because he's pitching so well down the stretch in the SEC. He's just dominant. After a certain point in time, there are guys in the big leagues who have bad deliveries, and at a certain point in time, you have to say, how do I not take this guy based on what I've seen this year? So I think it can figure in. I'm trying to think of some guys who are coming off of injuries that could happen to. I think back, a couple of years ago when Cade Horton had a huge postseason after missing all year. and then landed in the first round and just got called up to the big leagues by the Cubs, after making it the first round. So, like I said, I think it's somewhere in the middle there where you definitely need to look at it, but you can't let it be the only thing. And we're human, though, because sometimes that last impression is the one that sticks in your mind.
Well, and staying in the SEC and talking about improving your draft stock, I mean, obviously we're very close to a college player improving his draft stock when you talk about a guy like Travis Bazzana, right? Whenever he came out of prep, before he went to Oregon State, he was nowhere in the realm of being a first-round draft pick. Staying in the SEC at a place like Arkansas, there's a kid like Wiwa Aloy, for instance, who was relatively unheralded when he came out of Hawaii. I think he went to Sacramento State initially before he transferred to Arkansas. And now, all of a sudden, in the SEC on a good team, a potential national championship contending team, all of a sudden has a chance to probably, I think in Jim's last mock draft, he was maybe on the fringe of the first round. But is that the type of guy that going into an SEC tournament, going into a regional, super regional, fingers crossed as an Arkansas guy, the College World Series, is he the type of guy that in the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks, up until Omaha potentially, could leapfrog a few guys by having that sort of, early summer and putting himself in contention as a first-round pick?
Yeah, and it's funny, Jim and I were just talking about him. He's a tough one to figure out where to put. I mean, he has been performing. The power has shown up, and you can't ignore that again. Sort of beating the SEC drum again, but you can't ignore that. And teams are not going to ignore that. So I think if he keeps that up, then he's going to find his way into the first round, somewhere. There's the swing and miss. There's a little concern there, but he's been getting to his power. He's making a lot more contact than he did a year ago, where the power showed up, but the rest of the numbers were a little questionable. So I do think that he is a guy. I just finished sort of rolling out my mock, and I was like trying to figure out where to put him. I'm like, I just think he's going to keep floating up, because college hitting performers in big conferences tend to go in the first round. So yeah, I think he's going to help himself. And honestly, if say he cools off, I don't think it'll hurt him that much. He's kind of the guy that if I were to guess right now, he could go in that sort of comp round range, just like you said, right on that fringe of the first round. And it doesn't mean that he's not first round caliber, but someone, decide they could pay him a little extra and he goes in, to one of these teams that has extra picks or that sort of thing, but I do think that there are a few college bats who are having really big years that may have had some question marks. Maybe they're not perfect. There are no slam dunk college hitter, even Ava Arquette at the top. It's not everyone loves the swing. So I do think he'll end up floating up. Mason Neville is another guy who is further down on our 250. We're going to have to move him up, but that I think he's going to sneak into the first round because at a certain point in time when you play for a big college team and you've got 20 plus homers, you can't ignore that. And I think the same thing is happening with Aloy.
When does someone become on your radar? I know it's a tough question to ask, but maybe we can use an example. Like in our world, obviously, Brent Iredale is a name that we talk about a lot because he's a cool story from Australia, goes the JUCO route, just like a lot of players do. Now he's having a pretty good first year, and then all of a sudden he's in the top 150 of a list you published when maybe he probably wasn't on people's radar, even in Australia a few years ago. So when does someone come on your radar? Maybe use Brent Iredale as an example of how that even came about.
So I don't know the genesis story for Brent Iredale because Jim Callis and I split the country in half. And I won't give you the not directly in half, but he has Arkansas as part of his coverage. So we put out a top 100 for the following year's draft in December of the previous year, based on somewhat their sophomore years, but the scouting industry largely isn't focused on that. Some teams started employing scouts looking at underclassmen, but mostly from the summer, and then also from fall baseball. I'm going to guess that he was on Jim's radar when we did that top 100. I mean, Jim is probably the most thorough human being on the face of the planet. Oh, yeah. And so I'm sure that he knew who he was because, Iredale put up huge numbers in JUCO. He may have even known who he was last year, to be honest with you. I wish I could show. I don't have it, but when we do day 2 of the draft, which is insane because we do pick by pick live, rounds 3 through 10, and we always get to a point where we don't know a player, but Jim's notes are insane, and he prints them all out on the aforementioned mythical paper. And yeah, and he goes pretty deep in each of the areas that he has. So if I were to guess, I guess, the funny thing is that Iredale was in my part of the draft for junior college. He was in New Mexico, and he did not cross my radar. But I think because I'm sure he knew who he at least knew of him in the fall. And then when we went to do the 150 and he had gotten off to such a huge start, that's when he came up. So it's usually some, that first go round when we work on that top 100, we build out lists, and there are lots and lots of guys on the list who don't make the 100, but are like, well, we may want to keep an eye on that guy. And someone like that, where you don't totally know what to make of, junior college in New Mexico numbers, that maybe, okay, area scouts in Arkansas said, he's interesting, he's hitting the ball hard, keep an eye on him. And then when he got off to a good start, that's how he landed on our top 150.
That answers the question. And it's an interesting web. It feels like, I don't know what that meme is where, you have the guy with all the different lines trying to connect all of the different dots of the players until someone finally does something interesting enough to make that list. It's kind of cool. But was Travis Bazzana on your half of the
Yes.
country when you were covering him? Yeah, because you've written quite a bit about him, and even now in college. But Bazzana, I'm going to get my last Australian bias question in here too. That would have been a fun story, I'm sure, even for you to cover, just seeing the rise of Travis Bazzana and everything that went into his story too.
Oh, without question. And we were both fascinated. There's certain guys, obviously the top of the draft guys we're all familiar with, even if it's not in our half the country. When you start getting into the 150 range, then I'm like, I got to look them up. But what Travis Bazzana was able to do was absolutely amazing. And it's a path that you just don't see. It's not, you can't even compare him, to, I don't know what you would compare him to, because this is not really happened. There were some teams that were interested, before he went to Oregon State, as an international, free agent. I think he made the right choice, especially from a financial standpoint, but he really wanted to go. I mean, we had him on our podcast pre-draft, and he's great to talk to. Mm-hmm. And, he was very keen on proving himself. And it sounded like the Oregon State coaching staff knew right away that this was not just some kid coming from Australia. I mean, obviously they knew who he was, they recruited him, things like that, but how he got there, and, it was a bit of a leap of faith. And the thing that really has stood out to me, and even in talking to him, is his ability to talk about hitting at a PhD level. I mean, there's insane. I mean, there are guys who are tremendous hitter. I'm like, and I think maybe unfairly that it's a little more surprising when it comes from someone not from here, or, the Dominicans, say, if I could speak Spanish, it's not that Australia, baseball in Australia isn't big, but I think there's a a little bit of a bias, that where you think, okay, he's a great athlete, but like, really? Like, I mean, there have been some good Australian players who've come to play in the big leagues, but it's usually after they've played, at a high level at an older, or they sign super young and it takes them forever to make it to the big leagues. And even the ones that have made it, I love Justin Huber, but Justin Huber was never quite what we thought he might, he might be after, seeing him in the futures game. So I think all of it was surprising, and you could talk hitting with him for hours and not get tired of it.
Yeah, I think what always surprises me when talking to Travis is everything slows down for him, like in an interview setting, like it would on the field setting, almost as if he was a pitcher, right? The way that he's able to really zone in, slow things down, and really thoughtfully and carefully answer things when you ask him questions. That's always fascinated me about him. Before we let you go, John, I do want to just circle back to sort of some draft scenarios. Not obviously not to spoil your mock draft that's coming out. But you did mention just a second ago, potentially if the Nationals do go for one of these ready arms, and Ethan Holiday, who may have struggled a little bit at that showcase, I think it was a month or so ago, and he starts to fall in the draft. It's a realistic thing that could happen, right? How far realistically could he fall if he's not taken first overall?
He won't get past 4. The Rockies.
As a Cardinal fan, that's what I was hoping you wouldn't say.
Yeah. It's funny. I've talked to a couple of teams. When we do these early mocks, we don't really check in with every single team just because it's too early and no one really knows. So I try to make sure that I have a name that resonates. So it was someone picking like in the 11 to 15 range, and they're like, I was hoping Holiday would drop to us, jokingly. I just don't, given the history with the Rockies and Matt Holiday, I can't imagine. And I think, listen, the Mariners have taken a bunch of high school hitters. I don't know that the Mariners would pass Ethan Holiday up, so, and the thing is, if the Nationals don't take him, then I'd be very curious to see what the Angels do, right? Because they haven't been faced with, I mean, I guess they could have taken Connor Griffin, Bryce Rayner last year, and opted for Christian Moore. So this is a slightly different. They have a chance to get a number 1 pick caliber player, and they're picking 2. But I just can't, unless I am told specifically by someone within the Angels organization that that's what they'll do. Like in my last mock, I have to give them a college player of some sort. So let's say the Nationals take Seth Hernandez, or let's say that they take any non-Ethan Holiday pick. I think that then Holiday doesn't, he doesn't go 2, so then it'd be 3 or 4.
Yeah, right. So it essentially it looks like the Rockies, at least in your opinion, will take one of the 2 top prep players, either the arm or the bat, because obviously they don't necessarily need the help that's going to be in the big leagues in the next 8 minutes. So it looks like no matter sort of how the chips fall, you see the Rockies potentially taking one of those 2 prep players. I
mean, I think it's possible. They don't have a great track record of taking high school right-handers that high. So, and I don't know how much that comes into play. It's largely a lot of the same people. So I don't know if they have Riley Pint on their brain and don't want to go down that road, but they could take. Listen, one player they take at number 4 isn't going to reverse the fortunes of where they are right now, but having, say, Ava Arquette be there in a year with Chase Dollander there, maybe you can start building a little momentum, and they have a pretty solid farm system, and they have some guys who are a little bit lower down on the rungs of their system. So if you could plug someone in above them who gets, or maybe joins them high A, double A, or whatever, it'd be worth considering. I think with this draft, when you're picking 4, you consider every player that is available in all quadrants, demographics.
Is the MLB draft getting more popular from a fan standpoint, do you think, in the last few years?
That's hard for me to answer because
it's your world.
I'm so enmeshed in it. So I hope so. It's never going to be the NFL draft or even the NBA draft for from pretty obvious reasons. The biggest, which is those college sports, are so much more popular, and those players go straight to the highest level. So you get to see your return on investment instantaneously. I do think that there has been growing interest in amateur baseball. I think more people are watching college baseball and more people are paying attention to the draft because look, there's a proliferation of people doing the stuff that Jim and I do in terms of ranking prospects and doing mock drafts and things like that. They're all over the place. We're fortunate enough to have a platform as large as MLB.com, but The Athletic with Keith Law and ESPN, and of course with Kylie McDaniel, and of course the Baseball America guys. Those are the sort of the bigger platforms, and then there's like lots and lots and lots and lots of others doing some kind of coverage. So I do think, even if it's a little bit niche still, the niche has grown.
I would agree with that even too, because I'm in some group chats from back home. I'm from near Toronto, and even the other day I had a couple people that were messaging me about Billy Carlson, and like they have no business knowing what Billy Carlson or who Billy Carlson is. And then someone goes, well, if they're looking at shortstop, what about this guy from Oregon State? So like, I don't know. I love all this fan chat that, all of a sudden they're debating about Jay's first round players who are probably years away from ever stepping on a field at Rogers Center. But I think that's kind of cool. I think the chat has increased, at least in my world, it has.
No, I think that's great. So they're all Arjun Namala fans, I would imagine. I'm a big Arjun Namala fan. I love him.
Yeah.
I got to spend some time with him and his family pre-draft, so I feel very invested. That was their first round pick from last year, for those who are wondering how we veered in that direction. But listen, I hope so, because I think that, it's exciting. I love being able to be among, the people who bring these players to, a larger fan base's attention. I hope that continues. I think there's a lot of room, in terms of people who want to do this kind of work. I think the more lights that are put on, the amateur baseball scene and the draft and prospects, the better it is for all of us that cover it. There's been, that's a rising tide raises all boats kind of thing there, but that's what I was aiming for.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I was going to say that I have seen, even from being in Australia, the rise in popularity of college baseball in the last half decade to decade among people watching it. Obviously, in the SEC, it's always sort of been a big thing, but just it's televised more. People tend to follow college baseball a little bit closer than what they used to, just as a casual baseball fan. So I do think that in some ways probably has contributed to the MLB draft being probably more popular than what it was in the past. If there's one guy, Jonathan, who's not going to be in your first round of your mock draft, but a guy that you've got your eye on and you think this guy could be a potential 10-year big leaguer, this guy could be a star, but we're not going to hear his name called in the first round. Who's that sleeper? Who's the one sleeper pick you think?
What a question.
That maybe people, and a question without notice too, by the way, sorry. Where, people look back and go, how did we let that guy fall to the third, the fourth, the fifth round, whatever it may be?
The third
Who's
round,
that guy?
I was looking at guys like just missing my mock. I should have this answer at the ready.
You shouldn't. It's an impossible question, and I put you on the spot.
Well, no, this is listen, I wrote an entire book about sort of the undervalued guys, so I should always know the undervalued guys off the top of my head. But I'm taking a quick peek. You want third round?
Smart, Wrong, and Lucky, the Scouting Baseball's Unexpected Stars.
Yeah, I was fishing for that plug, so I appreciate that.
While Jonathan Mayo is looking for the next guy that he's going to write about in his next book that comes out in a few years' time.
So I'll give you, I'll give you one guy who's kind of still sort of high up. Don't know that he'll go in the first round, but I'm going to bank on the bloodlines, and that's Quentin Young. That's Dimitri and Delman Young's nephew, both of their nephews. It's a third brother's kid who reclassified. He's just big and strong and athletic. He plays shortstop in high school. He probably won't play short, although he looked better this spring than he had. There's a lot of swing and miss, so that's where people pause, but the power is real. And I think you could put him at third or put him in right field, and he might be that sort of prototypical run-producing corner outfield type of guy. So I don't have him in the first round. I think someone with some extra picks may take him in the comp round or the second round. So that's not as deep a dive. And I'm struggling to come up with another name for you. I mean, there's some really, if you go down, there's some really interesting name. I mean, Jaden Stroman, that's Marcus's younger brother, who until very recently, and I'm only thinking of him because I'm like really like scrolling down the list in a hurry. He was a shortstop and didn't really want to pitch for the longest time. And then, he can't really hit, or that's what I was told. They didn't think he was going to hit. And he started pitching better. He's a little more physical and bigger than his brother, but he's still super athletic. Like he can run, he had raw power at the plate. It wasn't like he was without skills, but he's up to 97 with his fastball. And then he's got a maybe plus curveball, which makes sense. I know something in the Stroman genes that allows you to spin a curveball, but he's like really kind of interesting because it's a little raw. I think he's another guy. And then I'll throw out one more. Gustavo Melendez is the top player from Puerto Rico, and he's only 17. He's not the biggest guy in the world, but he can really hit. It's going to be extra base stuff. I don't think it's going to be a lot of power, but some people give him a little bit of an Ozzy Albies kind of comp, and no one thought Ozzy Albies was going to have a lot of power, and he's obviously had a good amount of power, and Melendez can play short. And, the guys from Puerto Rico, when they're someone who's good, stands out a little bit more because baseball overall is down there a bit. And so sometimes maybe it takes them a little while, but then they start getting going. And, in an Edwin Arroyo with the Reds kind of way. So he was one that when I was like talking to scouts about him and writing him up, like he might be pretty good when all is said and done, but no one's going to have to pop him in the first round to get him.
Funny story about Jaden Stroman. I saw him pitch in Tainan, Taiwan when he was 12. And you knew he was good. It was a U12 World Cup just before COVID. The last one that I went to, actually, in Taiwan back in 2019. And you could tell the kid was going to be good, and it was so fun to follow his appearances during that tournament because Marcus Stroman was live tweeting basically his brother's starts in the U12 World Cup, which I was broadcasting. So it was actually a lot of fun. I had no idea that he was in this draft class, seeing that he's been committed to Duke, and it sounds like that he will actually opt to go professionally. But it's funny that you mentioned it brought flashbacks.
Some of that will depend on, when he goes,
Yeah.
I don't think it's a slam dunk. He may want to follow in his brother's footsteps.
Yeah. And probably no surprise to anyone who knows the Stroman family that he's committed to a school like Duke, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely right.
Jonathan, thanks for joining us today. You do have a book called Smart, Wrong, and Lucky. I think our Australian audience would probably appreciate it. A term in the baseball world that people like to use a lot here is a sliding door moment, which if people use that term a lot in the Australian baseball community, they should probably read your book, which is largely, we like to think we're diamonds in the rough over in Australia too. So, get on Smart, Wrong, and Lucky, the origin of baseball's unexpected stars, which is a great book by yourself, Jonathan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us, Jonathan. We'll be watching your mock drafts intently, and people can find all your work at MLB.com, or a lot of your work, not all of it, in your podcast as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, guys. It was a lot of fun.